This video is sponsored by Dubby Jitterless Energy Blend. Click on the link in the description and use the code PackerMan to save 10% on any order.
May the 27th, 1997. One of the most infamous tornadoes in the history of meteorology. And certainly one that Central Texas certainly won't soon forget. Because even after a quarter century, it's still regarded as one of the most devastating tornadoes in world history. And as one of the two tornadoes, another one would occur 2 years later, that would change the face of the Fujita scale as we knew it. I, of course, am talking about the 1997 Central Texas tornado outbreak, and within it, one of the most powerful tornadoes to ever exist. The F5 Jarrell tornado, also known as the Dead Man Walking. That's what we're going to be covering here today, here on Tornado Tales.
Oh, that is scary. The truck is, oh my gosh. Holy smokes.
What's happening, ladies and germs? This is the PackerMan, and welcome to this edition of Tornado Tales, where today we are going to be talking about the tornado that's simply known as the Dead Man Walking, the 1997 Jarrell F5 tornado. I realize it's been a minute since the previous episode, but as per the usual, I've been busy with a lot of stuff. But we're here now, and we're going to be talking about this particular storm. I remember all those years ago watching this storm on national television, and then in documentaries years afterwards. This is probably one of the most intimidating looking tornadoes to ever exist, because when you see that one long shot from far away of this tornado, and you see the winds just circling around at a high rate of speed, and it kind of has that diagonal look to it, and it's just an absolute monster. If a view like that doesn't send chills up and down your spine, nothing will. I can't even imagine what the people who were filming this tornado, who filmed this tornado, must have been feeling watching this absolute behemoth chew up the Texas countryside. This is also one of the most unusual tornadoes to ever exist. I mean, the stuff from this tornado and the horror stories from it, I mean, it's just absolutely incredible. Stories of how everything was just pulverized. And by everything, I mean houses, I mean little items, even farm animals, and yes, even humans. Some people who perished in this tornado were never even found. And there was one person who could only be identified by the ring on their finger, which was attached to a torso that had otherwise been completely decapitated and dismembered. And this tornado was so incredibly powerful and so incredibly slow moving that it damn near wiped Jarrell, Texas off the face of the map. What also made this tornado so unusual was this. Usually, when you see tornadoes in the Texas Panhandle, they usually go on a northerly trajectory with a slight tilt to the east. That's usually what you would see with Texas storms. This one traveled southwest, which was highly unusual. Now, we've already established that tornadoes can occur at any time, anywhere, and can move in any direction. But a tornado in the Texas Panhandle moving southwest is highly unusual. And unfortunately for the little town of Jarrell, Texas, its southwesterly trek put it right directly in its path. In particular, the Double Creek subdivision. On this day, May the 27th, 1997, it was known as the Central Texas Tornado Outbreak. There were actually 20 tornadoes that occurred with this outbreak, mainly along the Interstate 35 corridor from northeast of Waco to north of San Antonio. And they were all different levels of power. There were 6 F-Zeros, 6 F1s, 3 F2s, 3 F3s, and a singular F4. But, as is usually the case with high-profile outbreaks like this, there's always that one tornado that stands out above all the others. And in the case of this outbreak, it was the F5 tornado that struck Jarrell, Texas. Where to even begin with this tornado? The stories behind this tornado is just absolutely incredible. And the visual of it, as I've said, was just imposing. And Double Creek Estates in downtown Jarrell was just absolutely devastated. So, what was it about this tornado that made it so absolutely devastating and absolutely imposing to get the maxi tornado rating of a 5? Well, let's get into it, shall we?
And it was moving so slow. It was just barely moving.
There were 3 funnels when I looked up, 3 small ones, and they all went together and made one huge tornado.
In the afternoon of May 27th, a deadly tornado touched down. It was to leave a trail of destruction.
So, Jarrell, Texas. At the time, it was a modest town at the time that had a population of about 450 people. Ironically enough, it had been struck by tornadoes in 1987 and 1989. The 97 Jarrell tornado is also the first and only known occurrence of an F5 tornado in Williamson County. So, and it was also the deadliest tornado in Texas since the 1987 Saragossa tornado. Now, the thunderstorm that spawned the Jarrell tornado began west of Temple along the flanking line of another thunderstorm earlier in the afternoon of May 27th. The storm produced several tornadoes in Bell County, including an actually not an EF3, an F3 that impacted communities along Lake Belton. Weather radar observed a strengthening mesocyclone within the thunderstorm with a speed rotation rising above 40 knots, or 46 miles per hour. As the storm moved into Williamson County, it produced 2 short-lived F2 twisters north of Jarrell. As the cat decides to get in the way. Lay back down. As the storm moved into Williamson County, it produced 2 short-lived F2 tornadoes north of Jarrell at 3:25 p.m. and 3:35 p.m. The latter of the 2 was actually a multiple vortex tornado, but lifted at 3:39. So as per the usual, you have a supercell thunderstorm dropping multiple smaller tornadoes in rapid succession. And when a supercell thunderstorm does that, eventually it's going to drop a big one. An all-powerful storm that is going to absolutely ravage the countryside. Unfortunately, that was the case here with the Jarrell tornado. The Austin San Antonio National Weather Service Forecast Office issued a tornado warning for Williamson County at 3:30 p.m. in response to the storm's approach. The warning was put into effect for 1 hour. This was the first tornado warning of the day issued for the office's warning area and warned the city of Jarrell is in the path of this storm. Because again, it was on a southwesterly track. The local warning sirens went off about 10 to 12 minutes before the tornado struck. So, people in the city of Jarrell actually had plenty of time to prepare for this tornado. So, hats off to the National Weather Service. I mean, they tried everything in their power, to warn the people. And, local warning sirens were going off basically 12 minutes before the tornado struck. Now, the precise touchdown point of the Jarrell tornado was difficult to pinpoint. The tornado appeared as a narrow and rope-shaped funnel when it touched down at about 3:40 p.m. just within the Williamson County line, 3 miles north of Jarrell. And like the pair of F3s earlier in the day, it developed along the gust front produced by its parent thunderstorm. This mechanism is typical of tornadogenesis, not associated with supercell thunderstorms. Traffic all along Interstate 35 came to a complete stop as the tornado descended nearby. The Texas Highway Patrol also stopped traffic on both sides of the interstate under the expectation that the tornado would cross the highway. Instead, it decided to move parallel to the highway instead of just crossing it. It was tracking south-southwest, and it quickly intensified and grew to a half-mile in width, changing from its initial thin and white appearance to a blue and black color. This was within minutes of the tornado's formation. When a tornado goes from a thin little rope tornado, probably nothing to, get excited over, to a half-mile wide behemoth in literally minutes, that's when you know this tornado's got some power behind it. And it would eventually become one of the most devastating tornadoes ever recorded, because the amount of damage that it would do in Jarrell, especially to Double Creek Estates, we'll get to that here in a minute. But F5 tornado damage was identified early in its path. And it also, and you might have heard this before, scoured the ground and stripped pavement from roads. The tornado tore 525 feet of asphalt, nearly a half a mile of asphalt, as it crossed County Roads 308, 305, and 307. The thickness of the asphalt pavement was roughly a little less than an inch. A culvert plant at the corner of County Roads 305 and 307 collapsed. Nearby, a similar plant and a mobile home sustained some damage, with the latter struck by a 2x4 piece of lumber. That's the other thing about powerful tornadoes like this. 2x4s and, big debris literally become just missiles. This is why meteorologists always warn people to not stand outside in the middle of a tornado and watch it, because these tornadoes can literally throw these objects from miles in all directions and at a high rate of speed. And the likelihood of a big piece of debris coming down on top of your head is exponentially higher, especially in a powerful tornado like this. And here's another thing about this tornado. There were people that died in this tornado that actually took proper precautions to survive this tornado, but nonetheless perished in the tornado. Case in point, there were three people, I believe it was, in a mobile home that were 500 feet northwest of the culvert plant. They fled to a frame house. What should have been, a much better piece of shelter, to ride the storm out in. The tornado actually struck it directly. It was directly in the tornado's path. The evacuees were killed, while the mobile home sustained only minor damage. Now, ain't that about some shit? Some of the most extreme damage at this location was inflicted to a small metal-framed recycling plant that was completely obliterated, with little left of the structure besides a few twisted structural beams. And then it finally entered Double Creek Estates, where it exacted its most catastrophic damage. At the same time, the twister expanded to its maximum width of 3/4 of a mile. Eyewitnesses indicated that the tornado's movement had slowed dramatically to around 5 to 10 miles per hour. That is, in terms of a tornado, that is slow. I mean, you could probably run faster than the speed this tornado was moving. This may have contributed to the resulting extreme destruction, because with this tornado being as big as it was and moving as slow as it was, there were houses and buildings subjected to tornado force winds for almost 3 minutes. In a tornado, that's an eternity. So, staying above ground was not an option. It was not an option whatsoever, because with as powerful as this tornado was, how powerful its winds were, staying above ground was not an option. It was not a survivable option if you were in this tornado's path. Unfortunately, much of the neighborhood didn't have basements. No, I think almost none of the homes had any basements. I mean, there was something in the neighborhood of 20 people that were crowded into a single tornado shelter. The tornado destroyed the first home it encountered at the northwest corner of the subdivision. A clock recovered from the remaining debris was stopped at 3:48 p.m., presumably marking the time the tornado entered the community. Much of the neighborhood was completely swept away with little debris remaining, with what was left being reduced to small and unrecognizable fragments that were dispersed over a wide area. I mean, what was once a subdivision filled with nice homes and all that stuff, I mean, especially with how this tornado was doing ground scouring as well, I mean, it looked like a bomb had gone off, and it just completely obliterated everything. Mud was everywhere. I mean, trees were debarked, and some were even uprooted. I mean, it honestly looked like a blasted wasteland you would see in, say, if you play video games in the Fallout universe, something like that. Like, it's absolutely insane the amount of damage that this tornado caused. The lack of large items that were recovered and the granularity of the debris was indicative of the sheer strength of the tornado. And due to the tornado's slow movement, homes near the center of its path experienced tornadic winds for approximately 3 minutes. The mostly wooden framed residences, some well built and anchored, by the way, were completely obliterated and swept away, leaving behind concrete slabs swept clean of all debris. In some cases, parts of outbuilding and house foundations themselves in the subdivision were scoured away, and several were found missing all of their sill plates that connected the wood frame houses to the foundations. Pieces of debris were found deposited in fields miles away from the subdivision, and extreme ground scouring occurred, reducing grassy fields into wide expanses of mud in the most severely affected areas, which also made rescue efforts quite a bit difficult, trying to traverse through all this mud. In some cases, the ground was scoured out to a depth of 18 inches. 18 inches. That's 1.5 feet. Imagine a tornado this big, 3/4 of a mile wide, digging out basically what amounts to a trench, almost 1.5 feet deep. Wrap your head around that shit. Vehicles in the neighborhood were tossed and mangled beyond recognition. At least 6 were found flattened in open areas and coated with mud and grass. Some were thrown as far as 1/2 mile away. Remember, some cars weigh almost a ton, 2,000 pounds, and this tornado was just picking them up and tossing them like they were toys. And others were torn into multiple pieces of unrecognizable metal. Trees in the neighborhood were completely denuded and stripped entirely of all bark as well, including one that was found with an electrical cord impaled through the trunk. An electrical cord impaling a trunk. Like, if that doesn't tell you how powerful this tornado was, I don't know what does. I don't know what does. All the fatalities associated with the Jarrell tornado occurred at Double Creek Estates. At the time, it consisted of 131 residents, living in 38 single-family homes and several mobile homes. Unfortunately, entire families were killed at Double Creek, including all 5 members of the Ego family, all 4 members of the Moring family, and all 3 members of the Smith family. Bodily remains were later found at 30 locations, and the physical trauma inflicted to some of the tornado victims was so extreme that first responders reportedly had difficulty distinguishing human remains from the remains of animals at the site. Most of the deaths were attributed in the morbidity and mortality weekly report to multiple trauma, although one death was attributed to asphyxia, choking to death. The high intensity of the tornado left those in its path with little recourse. Most homes in Double Creek Estates were built on cement slab foundations, and few had a basement or any form of storm shelter. 19 people sought refuge in a single storm shelter. Some residents who followed prescribed safety measures nonetheless perished. One survivor holed up in a bathtub and was flung several hundred feet from her house onto a road. The walls of some houses along the tornado path remained intact, protecting some of those who survived the tornado. Others chose to evacuate ahead of the approaching tornado, which normally in that case meteorologists advise you to not do that because you never know how fast the tornado is going. Although in this case, with as slow as this tornado was moving, evacuating or getting out of the way was probably the best course of action considering the strength that this tornado had. 40 structures were obliterated in Double Creek Estates. 3 businesses adjacent to Double Creek Estates were also destroyed. In total, the tornado dealt $10 to $20 million in damage to the neighborhood. Around 300 cattle grazing in a nearby pasture were killed, and some were found a quarter of a mile away. Hundreds of cattle were also dismembered, and a few cows were also skinned by the tornado. The Jarrell tornado turned slightly towards the south-southwest after traversing Double Creek Estates. The damage in these outlying areas was somewhat scattershot. In one case, a mobile home suffered only minor damage, while an adjacent house lost half of its roof. Metal buildings were unroofed along County Road 305 south of Jarrell. The road's guardrail was impaled by wooden planks thrown by the strong winds. The tornado then again crossed County Road 305 and entered a forest of cedar trees. Some of the damage to the trees suggested that the tornado may have been a multiple vortex tornado, which is documented by Scott Beckwith, and it received its nickname, the Dead Man Walking. And legend has it, if you see the Dead Man Walking, you are about to die. And why is it called the Dead Man Walking? Well, with its multiple vortex characteristics, it gives it the appearance of a human with 2 arms and 2 legs walking. And if you look at several pictures, including the thumbnail for this video, you see that it does kind of look like a human. Hence why it got its name. Now, there have been several other tornadoes that have been given the Dead Man Walking nickname, or have been described as such, but I think this is the first known instance of a tornado being given that nickname. Hence why I call Jarrell the Dead Man Walking, because I think that's where the name originated for a tornado, describing a multiple vortex tornado. The path of damage left behind by the tornado ended abruptly shortly after entering this forested area, with the National Centers for Environmental Information indicating that the tornado lifted at 3:53 p.m. after remaining on the ground for, believe it or not, only 13 minutes and traveling 5.1 miles, although there are other accounts of the tornado actually traveling 7.6 miles. Either way, this is another thing that was so unusual about this tornado. It's not a long track tornado or a long lasting tornado. Typically when you hear of F5 behemoths or, powerful violent tornadoes, they usually stay on the ground for a long time and have very long damage paths, or what we call a long track tornado. This had none of the indicators of what you would expect from a maxi tornado. It moved southwest instead of north-northeast like you would typically associate with a tornado, especially in the Texas Panhandle. It moved slowly at 5 to 10 miles an hour. Usually F5 tornadoes are a lot faster than that. I mean, we've seen powerful tornadoes move as fast as 60 miles per hour. So this was a turtle by comparison. And then on top of that, it was only on the ground for 13 minutes. It basically petered itself out very, very quickly. But it left a lasting impression on the state of Texas, and in particular, the town of Jarrell. Like, this tornado was just incredibly unusual and incredibly powerful. Over the next several days, the Office of the Federal Coordination for Meteorological Services and Supporting Research carried out aerial and ground surveys of the tornadic damage in Texas in coordination with the Texas Wing Civil Air Patrol. The Jarrell tornado damage was classified as F5 severity throughout most of the tornado's path. However, this is where the first critique of the Fujita scale came into being and would eventually lead to the changing of the Fujita scale and to what is known as the enhanced Fujita scale. And it was published by the National Institute of Standards and Technology and suggested that winds between 158 and 206 miles per hour, which was corresponding to an F3 on the scale, were sufficient to explain the damage wrought by the Jarrell tornado. The critique noted that some of the homes in Double Creek Estates, although built within the preceding 15 years, exhibited structural weaknesses in their design, such as the lack of anchor bolts and steel straps in their foundations. This would become a big talking point, especially after the Super Twister hit in 1999. For those that don't know, the Super Twister is what I dub the Bridge Creek Moore tornado. And it was after these two tornadoes that a lot of discussion kind of started in the Weather Enterprise about, hey, maybe the Fujita scale is a little bit outdated because it only gave vague descriptions of what the damage was and didn't really take into account structural integrity of the buildings. So, eventually, in 2007, the old Fujita scale was phased out of usage, and the enhanced Fujita scale was born, which now took into account 28 different damage indicators to indicate the power of a tornado. And one of the main factors of determining how powerful a tornado was does a building have anchor bolts and steel straps in their foundations? Was it well built? Stuff like that. But that wouldn't come into play, at least at this point, for several more years. Approximately $40 million in damage was inflicted upon property, with another $100,000 inflicted upon crops. 27 people were killed in this tornado. 45 buildings were destroyed. As I said, $40 million in damage. And there were 12 people that were injured by the storm, in addition to the 27 killed. Due to the unusual southwestern motion of the thunderstorm that caused the tornado, the sequence of weather events experienced by those affected was the opposite order of typical tornadic events. Typically, you have the rain of the parent thunderstorm, the wind, then the hail, and then the tornado on the backside. This was flip-flopped. You had the tornado first, then the hail, then the wind, then the rain. It was all ass backwards, basically. Despite the violence of the tornado and the presence of its associated mesocyclone aloft, the thunderstorm did not exhibit a distinct hook echo that you typically see with such tornadoes. This may have been also caused by the unusual southwestern motion of the thunderstorm, resulting in the tornado's placement in an atypical position relative to the thunderstorm's motion. Now, afterwards, there were law enforcement officers from the Texas Department of Public Safety, 4 municipal police departments, and 2 county sheriff's offices that aided in search and rescue efforts in the aftermath of the Jarrell tornado. The Texas National Guard and other volunteers from around central Texas joined in the search, whereas the Scott and White Blood Center facilitated blood donations, and a temporary shelter was established by the American Red Cross at the Jarrell High School for those displaced by the tornado, providing food and accepting clothes donations. And the agency's relief operations, covering residents of 211 homes, cost an estimated $250,000, and community donations covered at least $200,000 of those expenses. Eventually, a memorial was erected in downtown Jarrell bearing the names of the 27 people killed by the Jarrell tornado. And what I'm going to do right here is show you a clip of all 27 people who were killed in this tornado. We actually have, instead of just numbers, we actually have all of the people by name who perished in this tornado. The Jarrell Memorial Park was established near Double Creek Estates on the land of the former Ego family who perished in the tornado. The park contains 27 trees planted in honor of the victims. In 2019, the memorial was relocated to the park along the city's historical marker. The events and survivor accounts of the tornado were profiled in television documentaries such as the 1999 episode of HBO's America Undercover series titled Fatal Twisters: A Season of Fury, the 1999 BBC television series titled Twister Week, also known as Tornado Diary in the US, in an episode titled Tornado Alley, which was the seventh episode of the Discovery Channel program Storm Warning, and the 2006 documentary Ultimate Disaster on the National Geographic Channel. Despite the fact that Texas is basically right in the heart of Tornado Alley, this is actually the last F5 or EF5 tornado to strike the state of Texas, believe it or not. The 1997 Jarrell tornado was the last maxi tornado to strike the Lodestar State. There have been other tornadoes and other violent tornadoes that have struck Texas, but to date, the Jarrell tornado was the last one in the state of Texas to be given the F5 rating, and none having given an EF5 since the new Fujita scale went into effect in 2007. Needless to say, this tornado left a lasting impression not only on the city of Jarrell, but meteorologists, tornado historians, the whole works. The absolute incredible power of this tornado and the imposing imagery that it left. I mean, I was only in my teens when this tornado happened, and I remember watching it on national news, and I'm just like, holy crap, because of just how imposing this tornado was and how intimidating this tornado looked. I mean, I don't know how else to describe such an event. Unfortunately, there would be more to come for the U.S. down the line, including the 2011 super outbreak, which we're going to be covering the tornadoes from those in the near future. But needless to say, this tornado left a lasting impression in the weather enterprise as well, because eventually we got the enhanced Fujita scale replacing the old Fujita scale. This was one of the two tornadoes, including the super twister, that facilitated that change. So, even though it didn't last all that long, it left its mark nonetheless. And thus ends the story of the 1997 Jarrell F5 tornado. One of the most imposing tornadoes in world history, to say the least. But I thank you very much for watching this edition of Tornado Tales. If you have any suggestions for future tornadoes to be covered, leave them down in the comments section. I know some people have been doing that. Just bear in mind that there might be some suggestions that I'm already going to be covering. Speaking of future tornadoes that I'm going to cover, the next episode is going to answer the question: what was Ohio's deadliest tornado. And why am I asking that? Well, I live in the state of Ohio. And when I started doing this, I started thinking, what was the deadliest tornado in the state of Ohio's history? The answer surprised me because it was not the one I was thinking of. We'll get to that next time. But in the meantime, thank you very much for watching this edition of Tornado Tales. And until next time, this is the PackerMan signing out. See you later. What's happening, ladies and germs? Thank you for watching tonight's video. If you're interested in sponsoring the channel, there is a link to my Patreon down in the description box below. Otherwise, hit like and subscribe if you want to continue watching great content like you saw today. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, this is the PackerMan signing out.